I'm Christopher C. York, instructor of philosophy at Langara College.
And I'm Zan Plesner. I'm a student at Langara College.
And this is Synthesis and Sophistry.
All right, so on today's episode of the podcast, we are recording live on location in Aperture Coffee Bar on Main Street here in Vancouver. I think today's episode we're gonna kind of have an interview-style, casual conversation around philosophy and what it's like to be a philosophy professor. So to get things kicked off, I wanted to start with a question for you, Chris. So one thing I've been asked before, and I never really know how to answer it, is what is philosophy? Do you have an answer for that? And also with that, why is it still important nowadays when it seems like a lot of these questions maybe have gone into the background a bit more?
Yeah, if I don't have an answer to that question, I'm in trouble, right? I'm a bad salesman for my trade. So philosophy is a couple of things. I think it's, first and foremost, a way to parse the world in terms of component concepts and relationships between those concepts. So it's a language game, right, that helps us make sense out of the chaos of the given, right? So the sensory array that we're confronted with is daunting, and a lot of times it seems to defy the categorization and analysis. So philosophy is at least an attempt to dig past the surface and try, I think some people still think about this as the goal of philosophy, try to get to some kind of truth. And secondly, maybe as a correlate to this, philosophy is a program of intellectual self-defense, right? So it's given that the world can appear as chaotic and that we're often, let's say, confronted with people who try to foist their worldview on us. So they have a certain way of connecting the dots, but that's not the only way the dots can be connected. And so the pushback on received pictures of the world, I think, is more important than ever in a sort of post-truth, online echo chamber kind of intellectual climate. And so I think that it's partly a matter of defending yourself against these misleading pictures of the world, but also a forceful creative act in making your own constellation, finding your own pattern for connecting the dots. So it's half, you'd say, analysis and half poetry, right? A creative act.
Yeah, I've always liked that characterization of the analysis and poetry. I think that really lines up for me. And yeah, the sort of defense against the dark arts idea there. I think it's that's where it's helped me a lot in my life. Just trying to think about things in a more critical way, and using those tools that are learned in the classroom more widely, and helping, I think, other people hopefully think more clearly through things while I'm doing it as well. My next question here is, what distinguishes somebody who might be a thinker or a public intellectual versus somebody who is a philosopher, or just, Uncle Jimmy philosophizing versus someone with a degree like you? Is it just the degree, or what makes someone a philosopher, is my question.
Well, I think that I wouldn't be so elitist as to say that it's directly related to a piece of parchment, right? Whether or not you're a philosopher or not. But it probably has something to do with the quality and structure of the arguments you're making. I think that generally speaking, if you can follow a clear line of thought through your argument, and you try as best you can to stick to organizing facts and premises in an honest way, then you're probably proceeding well philosophically. When you engage in, irresponsible speculation, or you just iterate on the same point and become dogmatic or self-indulgent, I think you're probably behaving in philosophical bad faith. And I think that's where Uncle Jimmy, your character Uncle Jimmy, probably ends up somewhere around there. So it's hard to just give you a nice clean definition like A is a philosopher and B is not, but it's more of a know it when you see it kind of thing. And I do think that the more you expose yourself to different philosophers, the better that your radar for bullshit becomes, and the more easily that you can differentiate philosophy from mere rhetoric.
So I guess on that line, you pointed to rhetoric, but what differentiates, maybe in your sense, what a good philosopher versus maybe a bad philosopher is?
So this goes back to your defense against the dark arts kind of model, the Hogwarts model, right? So the title of our podcast is Synthesis and Sophistry, right? So the sophist just wants to be right and preys on the part of the human mind that tries to make sense of things. So we think along certain patterns, or we seem to think with a sort of logic that is, I wouldn't say universal, but generally found in members of our species, right? And that makes us both good analytic thinkers if we hone that skill. It also makes us prey to certain kinds of argumentative stratagems, right? The fallacies. If we don't watch ourselves and train that faculty carefully. It's a bit like an exploit, right? A computer is great for crunching data, but it has a few points of weakness. It can be infected by viruses, right? And so I think about like sophistry and rhetoric kind of like that. It's like malware for the human mind. And ideally, if you're well trained philosophically, you're able to resist uploading that malware and making an ass of yourself. And you're saying that you did this in your life, so maybe I'll ask you a question now. How have you found that philosophy's assisted you in resisting being intellectually bullied by others?
Well, I think for me, I am, like I think most people, drawn to rhetoric. I love a good speaker, and I think it's helped me realize that those speakers that I once maybe regarded as being really intelligent and not just like so beyond my level that I couldn't get what they're saying, like most of it's just gobbledygook in a rhythmic sort of way that's satisfying to let wash over you. Where now I'll still listen to people who are doing good rhetoric, and I can enjoy it, but be more cautious with it and pick it apart a bit more.
I think there's a parallel here with music. So, for example, when I listen to music, I'm very keenly appreciative and sensitive to the lyrics. And my girlfriend, not so much. She just listens to the beat. And she's like, the beat's what's important. I'm like, no. Like, you could be dancing to any sort of pernicious, that song that you're dancing to could be about the filthiest, most repugnant nonsense on the planet, and you have no idea if you don't listen to the lyrics. So I think that when you're talking about being swayed by rhetoric, you're letting the beat carry you away and you're not worrying about the lyrics, which could be kind of damning in a way.
Yeah, I think so, but I think rhetoric can be used effectively to drive a point home, and I think part of being a good lecturer, which I would classify you as, is a use of some level of rhetoric, not to the point where you're taking away from the point or trying to pull a fast one on people, but it's nice to spice up language and know how to speak with beats and persistence, but it shouldn't be the content rather than it shouldn't be the content. If
rhetoric's used to embroider or act as a casing for some stronger point or position, I don't think that's morally problematic. But if you're hiding spurious premises or conclusions in your rhetoric and using that as a sort of vehicle for, slamming your ideology down people's throats or into their brains, I think that's probably morally suspect.
Yeah, and again, just to go back to that defense against the dark arts idea, I think now when I hear people using rhetoric, I can stop them and say, like, no, what do you mean? Let's, go a bit slower here and dissect what you're saying. And I think philosophy is a great tool for that. So my next question is more of an autobiographical one. I think that's the term. What first drew you to philosophy, and when was that? And has that changed? Are you still drawn in the same way, or has your interest kind of meandered?
So I think that my interest in philosophy comes from my childhood. I was curious about the world, and especially curious about why things are the way they are or were the way they were. And religion did not have a very satisfying answer. It was patently bullshit. And I thought there has to be some better way of looking at the world, right? Than just putting on these weird goggles and pretending that a man who was born 2,000 years ago, for instance, had all the answers. Couldn't be improved upon or elaborated on, and now we have to live in lockstep with, this guy's idea of the way the world should be. I found that really limiting, cognitively and imaginatively, and so I cast about for other ways to think and live. And the adults around me, sad to say, weren't all that inspiring. They mostly just sit around and smoke cigarettes and drink beer and talk shit. And so that wasn't really illuminating either. And so I had to keep digging. I read some encyclopedias, or at least a good number of entries. And that was informative, but it still didn't give me the tools I needed for synthesizing all that information into a cohesive whole. And so then I took on a couple of philosophies, a bit like someone takes a dosage of a substance without looking at the effects. Like it just kind of, my first couple of years in college, I was hook, line, and sinker into various philosophers and philosophies without thinking as critically as I should have about the contents of those positions. And I just kind of got led around by the nose for a few years until I matured a little bit and was able to sort of see these offerings for what they were. They were different lenses for seeing the world, and you could choose to put them on or take them off as you saw fit. It wasn't a binding... I saw, at least originally, your choice of philosophy as a sort of spiritually binding decision that would, define who you were from the bottom up. And I think that that's maybe a naive way or the wrong way to go into philosophy. It's dangerous to think that way and to believe so wholeheartedly and uncritically in something. So in a way, I think I misused philosophy as the new religion until I was exposed to enough of it that I could become more well calibrated and critical about the discipline as a whole.
Yeah, I think I definitely identify with that experience. I never grew up religious, but getting a bit of idol worship, especially like Nietzsche when you're young and you first read it, it's so invigorating, and you're like, this guy just gets it. He really gets me, and you don't think through all the implications, and I think you bend over backwards, a lot like a sort of religious text to defend it in ways that maybe aren't defensible. And yeah, I think that's me coming back to school after reading philosophy on my own for a while, and it's helped me realize and given me the tools to look at them more critically, philosophies in general, rather than just taking them in as doses of medicine or whatever, without any sort of accompanying critical outlook.
Yeah, I relate with your experience as a mature student. So between my first couple of years of college and finishing off my bachelor's with those sort of remaining credits that were still hanging around, I took a 5-year break. And in that time, I explored myself, I explored the world, I tried some different jobs, and I kind of, when I returned, it was really me authentically that wanted to be there. It wasn't just like I've got nowhere else to go, so it might as well be university or college. And so I think that coming back to it after a break, after suffering and seeing the world a little bit more, you just get so much more out of it, right? So, and I think that you can carry that kind of revelation or realization to other parts of your life as well. And you realize how important it is to not be doing things that don't reflect your real values and that are inauthentic, and you see what a waste of time those are. And so when you find that thing that really keys you up and turns you on or whatever, I do think you have to, throw your weight behind it and really take a stab at it. And so I understand that you are interested in becoming a philosophy instructor, and I think you're off to a good running start, right? You read philosophy in your spare time. You co-host a podcast of your own volition on the subject, which to me says that you have a wholehearted and authentic interest in the subject. So, I think anybody who has that kind of attitude has an advantage over a lot of the field who might come to the discipline for the wrong reasons.
Yeah, I guess on that note, what has your motivation changed since you were younger, and how you view your relationship to philosophy? Like, what keeps you kind of bound to it, or maybe not bound to it, but interested in it still? And what does that interest look like nowadays compared to when you were just a young tyke reading your first Nietzsche?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that, sometimes the best way to explain is through analogy. And so I'm going to do that here. You can imagine, a kid that's been bullied, and he goes into his karate class, and all he wants to do is throw down and kick ass and defend himself. And that has some value, right? That's motivating for a while. But then maybe, 10 years pass, and you're not just doing it anymore as a reaction to being bullied. You're doing it now because you find beauty in the movements. You appreciate the gain in your physical and mental health from the practice. And you begin to see that it's part of you. It's not just a mask you put on. It is authentically part of you. And that's a different sort of realization, or it's a different approach to the discipline than just saying, I want X to get Y. Right? And I feel like when you're drowning in a sea of bullshit, as so many of us are, I feel like any rock that you can cling to, it's good enough. And I feel like when you find philosophy for the first time, like you put it in terms of reading your first Nietzsche, there's value in kind of like hanging on to that. But I think that value is different than the value that you find in it and take from it as a slightly more experienced practitioner.
Yeah, cool. I mean, that's somewhat been my experience, but maybe on a lesser level so far. Do you remember when you first realized you wanted to be a philosophy instructor, or what drew you to that role? Or was it the only pathway to have a viable career as a philosopher for you?
I mean, at first it was just like the subject that interested me the most. I had 3 subjects I was kind of pursuing concomitantly in university: philosophy, psychology, and theater. And in my head, I put it together in the following way. I said, well, philosophy gives you the concepts. Psychology, sort of helps you understand the human mind and how to get those concepts in there. And theater gives you the voice and the mode of presentation for, conveying those ideas most effectively. As it turns out, philosophy was the one that sort of fit my natural aptitudes the best. With psychology, a lot of experimental stuff, a lot of rigmarole, and designing building a better mousetrap in psychology wasn't, at that time at least, my forte. It wasn't where my interests laid. So theater, similarly, it seemed like, unless it was being put to some great social use, it seemed kind of empty. It seemed vacuous to me. And the whole practice of like learning relatively meaningless lines and just like learning your blocking, it seemed again like too much dog and pony work, right? Like it wasn't getting me where I wanted to go, and maybe I just didn't have the looks or the talent to be an actor, and so I had to sort of eat that one.
Hence the podcasting. How do you kind of see your role as an instructor? One thing that you've spoken to me about before is kind of trying to present yourself as authentic, but still respecting the role of not wasting people's times and being kind to your captive audience. How do you kind of parse that and think about what you want students to get out of your teaching style?
I've thought a lot about this recently, so this is a kind of timely question. I've expressed to you my dissatisfactions with people and positions that put too much focus on role-based behavior, right? I think that a lot of people wear their job like a straitjacket, and it really limits and circumscribes what they are and what they can become, what they can do, and they are lesser people because of the roles they inhabit. And I think that's sad and stupid. It makes for petty bureaucrats and tyrants. So I've always been conscious of trying to be equal to the role, right? You don't want to totally violate the purpose of the role, but to always try to be a bit more than the role as well, like to try to sort of sneak in other human bits of yourself into that role so that it's relatable to others. Nobody's inner life is so desertified, let's say, that they or desiccated, that they see themselves purely as, I don't know, I'm just a bartender. And if they do, that's a sad kind of life to live, I would think, right? So again, I have to stress the fact that you at least have to be equal to the role. If you're a heart surgeon, you have to be capable of doing heart surgeries. Your comedy routine is not welcome in the operating theater. Although maybe you get a chance to crack a joke or two and put everybody at ease before the operation, but that's not the focus of why you're there, right? So I do think that you can't be ignorant of the role you inhabit, but you have to also really strive to, I would say, instill other elements of your personality so that you like your role better and people like you in that role better. So don't leave the human on the cutting room floor. I think that's good material for almost any professional. Almost any job is made better if you can tell there's a human working it. And if there's anything that separates us from, AI, it should be that we can bring our life experiences or our quirky perspectives or values to bear in a relatively non-obtrusive fashion, or at least a helpful fashion, into the roles we inhabit. I don't know if you've had any experience with this, Zan. Have you had any experience with sort of role-based ethics? Have you ever been sort of pushed into a box, or have you ever tried to express yourself in ways that challenged the role that you were assigned?
I mean, yeah, I think it's really interesting. These different roles we have, it comes up in existentialism a fair bit, and how we can kind of, box ourselves in with them, saying, I am this thing. And yeah, I've met many people in my life where whether it's career or their family orientation or whatever it is, they'll take that on as an identity so that they can kind of feel safe. And I think work environments, because that really is our main sort of role that we take on. I like to be a little goofy in them and maybe break the rules of professionalism here and there. And I think people get it generally, because I try not to go too far. People are sometimes surprised by it, but in a good way. And I think it opens up that sort of dialogue for other people to do that as well. Then yeah, I've tried to put myself in as many different roles as I can, and it helps you realize the things you're good at and the things you're not so good at. I did like door-to-door sales for half a day and realized like, yeah, no, not a chance that I'm going to keep this up. But
I think the problem with roles is, they're manifold, they're multiple. So roles are at the same time an oversimplification and a distortion. So they're a distortion in that they're presenting they're presenting a warped picture of what a person is, for one thing, in an inauthentic way, right? So there might be parts of you and parts of your role that are fundamentally at odds with each other. And so at the end of the day, you have to choose, am I myself or am I my role? And, that's the sort of negotiation that all of us have with ourselves. But they're also an oversimplification, right? So let's look at our relationship, right? You're a former student. You're a current co-caster. I'm sometimes your employer, and I would like to think that I'm your friend at times as well. So that's a complicated relationship. It's messy. It's multivalent in an important way. And I don't think you can just boil down messy human relationships into one thing and say, okay, I've got it now. It's just this. And that's all. I think that's, again, being intellectually dishonest, and it's not doing justice to the phenomenon that we encounter and experience. Yeah,
I mean, if I ever write about this, I'm using the term mall cop energy because that's someone who I think inhabits a very silly role. Sometimes, like, if they take themselves too serious, you can see so quickly just how ridiculous that can become. But I guess on the other hand, while we're on the topic of roles, I do think that especially when they're culturally important, they can bring a lot of meaning into our lives, as long as we're not, holding onto them so tightly that it defines all of us. But like your role as a philosophy instructor, that seems like a role that you can blossom in, and that brings meaning to your life and your students as well, I think. And so, yeah, I think roles can be, they're good with a little bit of caution, using them and depending on the role to enhance your life and bring your capabilities about. Well, yeah.
I mean, it's not just your job too, but like, it's what you inhabit with your family, right? So there was a good decade of my life there when I was just so caught up in being, husband and father, that I essentially lost my identity, right? To a large extent, right? I forgot the sort of sources of my motivation and what constituted well-being for myself, and what my springs of action are. And I think that maybe a lot of people are living inauthentically because they think that things are demanded of them by their roles that really aren't. Like, we like to create prisons and excuses for ourselves in order to avoid our existential responsibility. And I think that the role it's a pretty convenient tool for just saying, for just ruling out possibilities. And there's good, biological reasons for that, right? A person who is unable to rule out possibilities is probably a bit mad. But a person who rules out too many possibilities is a bore. So I think there's a golden mean in there somewhere where you're not leaning on a role like a crutch to help you stop thinking about what you could be and what you want to do. But there's also enough good in a role that it gives structure to your life, and it can, ground your life projects, give them meaning. So, there's good and bad, right? There's a reason that we have all these masks that we wear. As long as we don't lose ourselves completely in them, I think that they're useful tools.
Agreed. All right. So another topic that I kind of wanted to touch upon, because you are specifically a philosopher of games. Why that area of philosophy over all these other areas? What draws you to that?
Well, you think about games. They're miniature attempts to capture some corner of the world. They're very much like philosophy, which I described as in the Wittgensteinian terms as a language game earlier. They're a way to sort of analyze a concept. And I think that they speak to the way that we like to structure our behavior and experience. So let's take chess as a very simple example, right? We sit down to play chess, and there's sort of an implicit contract in place that I'm not going to cheat, that I probably intend to complete the game, that I'm not going to get up to any other sort of silliness or, shenanigans while we're doing this thing. So there's a certain kind of morality of gameplay. There's a sort of, in the simulation of the world, there's an analysis and deconstruction of values that you can execute via gameplay. And I think it says a lot, too, about what we value, right? So this is, again, maybe boring the Seussian point, right? Games are what we do when we don't have to do anything else. And so they are implicitly something that we value pretty highly. But the real interest for me is looking at the philosophical question, which is, well, why? Why this and not that? Why this game and not another? And so I think if we start to look at categories of gameplay, and we start to talk about our ludic literacy as much as we think about our literacy in, books, arts, or music, I think that we can have what T. Nguyen's called a sort of library of agencies, potential agencies. So every time you play a game, you have a certain amount of capacity, hopefully, unless it's a game of complete chance, which I would call a bad game. You have the chance to express yourself in some way or try something out. And I think that very much like philosophy, a game gives you an arena in which you can exercise an intellectual capacity that you have no opportunity or reason to realize in your daily life. If your job is to drive a garbage truck, no one's going to ask you how to balance your country's GDP. But there are games where you can do just that. If you're sorting vegetables or serving coffee, no one's going to ask you, what's your strategy for terraforming Mars? But there's a game for that too, or how to solve a pandemic or whatever, right? So there's lots of different, let's say, ludic goals, right? In-game goals that you can adopt and take seriously in a fake way for a few hours. And it doesn't just give you an escape, it gives you a different kind of exercise for a short time.
Yeah, definitely. It's a sentiment I definitely agree with. It's interesting, too, us just talking about roles, and I think games, especially role-playing games, they can let you try on different identities for a little while, and this might be getting really off track and getting a little nerdy, but I've been playing the Resident Evil games lately, and it's just been interesting to me because most of the games I played in my life, you feel powerful, or video games at least, right? shotgunning aliens, stuff like that. But this game, you feel a lot smaller, and I guess just inhabiting that role of being vulnerable, it just gives you different phenomenology in such an interesting way. And I think a lot of games, they can test these sort of just areas that aren't inside our regular consciousness in really interesting ways, just in our relationships with other people. And I've had it like playing Monopoly. It brings things out in people where you're like, oh wow, you surprise yourself sometimes, just and maybe for me, like how competitive you can be, and the revelry in that.
But I mean, just like when you're playing Monopoly, it would be madness to really believe that you're Mr. Monopoly, right? And that you're really crushing your financial opponents, in the real estate market. I think it's also similarly insane, right, to sort of lose yourself completely in the role of the philosophy professor, right? And sort of like everything that you do is meant to emulate what that image of in your mind of a philosophy professor is. Well, a philosophy professor walks like this, wears a tweed jacket with, elbow patches, smokes a pipe, whatever. Right? So you take on all the affectations, and it's just as silly as thinking you're Mr. Monopoly, or maybe in Dungeons and Dragons, really thinking you are that level 4 barbarian dwarf or whatever, right? Like, it's taking your role too seriously in either case is a folly. And again, to go back to Suits on this subject, he says something like this: if we entertain the possibility that life is a game, we can enjoy it with the same sort of lightness of spirit that we currently enjoy when we do play things that we acknowledge as games. And so that gives us a lot more freedom from, let's say, the psychic baggage and burdens of a life that we feel that we're sometimes trapped in. Right. So if you think that you're free to buy or not buy any property in Monopoly, or explore or not explore any dungeons in Dungeons and Dragons or whatever, maybe you can feel a bit more free in your own life, and you don't have to be so punishing with regard to how you judge yourself, right? Because so many people conform their life goals and expectations to societal norms or maybe family aspirations, that they are radically unfree, really, deep down, because if they deviate from those paths, they'll beat themselves up. Nobody else will have to do it. They'll do it to themselves. And I think that's a shame. That's a real shame.
Yeah, and this makes me think of the role, like in games and in real life, that failure plays. We talked in existentialism about Emile Choron, and he always talked about how failure was a good thing, because you can build character from that, realize different capacities, and you can connect with other people on their failures. You always have there's no one worse in the when you're at a party, just the boastful kind of braggart who, oh yeah, I win at everything, life's just great for me all the time. It's easier to connect about our failures and showing our vulnerability there. And again, it's a cliche, but if you never fail, it probably means you've never tried at testing your capacities in any sort of way. Another question I was kind of floating around in my head while we're kind of talking about philosophy. Sometimes I often think about the line, I think it was John Stuart Mill who said, it's better to be Socrates dissatisfied than it is a pig satisfied. What do you see philosophy's role in life towards this attitude as? Like, do you agree with this? Because sometimes I have conversations with people, and they're very much, they just like to have hedonic pleasure all the time, and I kind of agree a lot of the time. Like, is philosophy just a way for us to navel gaze and feel good about ourselves? Or
I mean, what's left out of that slogan is that it's better still to be Socrates satisfied than either, right? So there's nothing that says a priori that suffering is wonderful and we should all, deny hedonic pleasure. I think that, probably being a happy philosopher means giving a good portion of your time over to animal pleasures and also the higher pleasures of the mind, right? There's got to be a good balance there. I think that it's possible to live a healthy life of the mind without becoming a self-flagellating ascetic, right? Because the lower pleasures they don't necessarily exclude the higher pleasures. You can have a healthy balance of both. It's not like a diet of just opera all the time or Fig Newtons and sex, right? You can choose both opera and Fig Newtons before or after, right? The opera, you decide. Now, it's maybe during. I don't know if you have like those nice theater boxes up there, maybe all the above. But the point being is that it's not an either or, right? That's a false dichotomy, and that's why I said it's better to be Socrates satisfied than either of those.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. Yeah, and it seems like when you explore things in an analytic way, it can sometimes bring about greater pleasures in those animalistic moments. You really appreciate drinking beer or having sex, whatever it is. Yeah, I guess, again, while we're talking about your role as a philosopher and mine as a philosophy student, one question or comment more I get a lot is like, philosophy, what are you going to do with that? Like, what's the use value of it? And I guess a lot of students may have that sort of same attitude that's been ingrained upon them. Like, what do you say to that?
Well, it's right there in my definition of philosophy. What did I define philosophy as? A way to, bring out the concepts and relationships between those concepts that describe the world more fully and honestly than the received picture. I think there's value in that for anybody, right? So seeing the world in a more original, more creative, more accurate way is something that we should all be interested in, regardless of the cash value. I think it's obviously it's a question from the point of view of a cultural Philistine, right? To say, well, what's that going to buy you? Love, what's that going to buy you? Right? It's like, it's not all about exchange value, but let's look at the other thing that I said philosophy was. It's a course in intellectual self-defense. So if you don't want to be intellectually bullied and harangued and fooled by rhetoric and hoodwinked, then you have an interest in at least studying some philosophy, or at least being aware of it, right? So I think that for those reasons, not to be fooled by rhetoric and not to see the world in an uncreative way that forces you to accept let's say a prefab picture of the way everything's laid out. I think those are great reasons to study philosophy, even if you don't continue in the discipline, even if you don't teach philosophy. I'm not going to go into all the other, I'm not going to descend to the point where I try to tell you, well, you can become a lawyer with philosophy. Yeah, that's true. There's other disciplines you can take on, advertising, whatever. You can use your philosophical skills in many, many different fields. It's not my job to try to advertise it in terms of how much money you can get in the associated trades, but rather to say that it's good in itself to have some philosophical training at least.
Yeah, I completely agree. Again,
do you want me to ask you some questions?
Sure, yeah. Let's see if that's fruitful.
Let's see if that's okay. So this is the section of the podcast where I turn the tables on Zan. All right, Zan. So you claim to be an adherent and lover of philosophy. Who's your favorite philosopher and why?
I get this question a lot, but every time that I really start to love a philosopher, I'll start to make sure that I'm critical of them, and then just really bring them down. So I definitely don't have a favorite, but I like a lot of the existentialists for sure. I've talked about him before. I like Nietzsche, I think, because of his style mostly. And yeah, that invigorating nature. I really like Martha Nussbaum. I think she comes from really interesting perspectives. And yeah, I always enjoy reading Peter Singer as well. I think he's so clear-headed and just uncompromising in his philosophy and rigor, and he's just always very clear. And now that we've talked about him on the podcast a few times, I'm really starting to like Thomas Nagel. I think he clears quite a few different areas and writes pretty coherently and kind of from a consistent voice. So those are a few that if anyone's listening and they want to start looking into philosophy, I think any one of those are pretty fruitful.
Okay, this is a tricky question. I just got this phone call. It's from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, and they've got funding for your master's program, but only if you can describe what your master's program will be convincingly in the next 3 sentences. Go.
Oh boy.
That's one sentence.
I think I've just been bouncing around ideas in my head, trying to think about what I might want to do, but I really like philosophy around love and relationships, both romantic and platonic. I think exploring that area, again, it's pretty vague, but that always really draws me in. So maybe something along that, even though it is quite vague.
Okay, so if I asked you, I mean, now to do a master's, you don't necessarily need to be incredibly specific, but if you had a thesis statement that you wanted to explore, what would it be? Just one sentence.
I really don't know. Maybe like one area around love that I'm interested in is like how far can you expand it before it no longer becomes love? Again, maybe that's not a super deep question, but I guess like one thing that really inspired me, I'm forgetting the philosopher right now, but he talked about love being a verb rather than a noun. It's something that we do and we kind of have to practice more than anything, and I like that a lot. Again, I don't have any coherent thoughts around it, but that's just something I've kind of been having in the back of my mind lately.
Yeah, it's interesting. So, I mean, I think you sort of hit on something with your first statement there, right? Like, what are the limits of love? I mean, love can be fleeting. So, what are the conditions that either cause love to decay or implode or become overextended, right? So what are the necessary and sufficient conditions, I suppose, for either being in love or loving, if you want to make a verb out of it? I think that's an interesting topic.
That's just one idea that I've kind of been floating around because I think it's a super interesting topic. Everyone can relate to it. And I do think it's again, like one of the fields that I enjoy most in philosophy is existentialism, and I think that there's so much there, but within existentialist philosophy and finding meaning in love and relationships, and again, maybe a philosopher that early on really inspired me was Epicurus, and how he thought that friendship was the highest sort of hedonic pleasure that you can have. So yeah, I just feel like there's always more to explore there. It's what we strive for as people so much of the time, and I guess just on UBC courses and possible areas of research, I'll be taking philosophy of art next semester, and I think that's another area. I love art. I love movies, music, and analyzing art, and especially in a philosophical way, and kind of, again, the sort of meaning-making aspect of life. I think there's a lot of fertile ground there, so again, vague, but.
So, of the, I don't know that you're excited about going to UBC in the fall and sort of beginning your undergraduate studies in earnest, but from your experience so far, what's been the course that's kind of opened things up for you and made you think that this is something you wanted to pursue in greater depth?
Yeah, I think existentialism was probably the number one. That's where I really started with philosophy, reading existentialists. They were most accessible and kind of related to my life. And taking that course and being able to discuss it, and even you taught that course. You asked us for readings, and being able to pitch a reading and us cover that reading was just super fun and just something that I looked forward to every week. I'd say that course, and then environmental ethics with Rana Ahmed. That was a really, really interesting course that just made me think about things on such a wider lens. And because I think I've always cared about the environment and had concern about it from a young age, but never really asked the deeper questions of like, okay, but why exactly do I care? And being able to pinpoint those in a more accurate way was pretty interesting and rewarding.
I mean, I think it's kind of like, to bring out the argument by analogy again, it's a bit like becoming a connoisseur and finally being able to justify why that wine or that coffee is your favorite, but now you've got the vocabulary for it, right? I think the important thing to do, though, in philosophy, as in every other discipline, is not to use it as a sort of weapon to sort of defend our prejudices, but maybe at first as an opportunity to explore our prejudices, right, and see if there's any basis to them. It sounds like that's what happened for you in environmental ethics. You already cared about the environment, but maybe you couldn't defend why, right? And so I do think that having that vocabulary provided for you is incredibly valuable. So you're probably more certain and sure about your opinions now than you were before that course, and now you've got the terminology that you need to sort of back up your position against, I would say, probably most interlocutors, right? Except for the most well-trained, right? You can probably anticipate and shut down or, address most objections that would be thrown your way, I would think.
Yeah, you heard that, debate bros. Come at me. No, please do not. Well, this was a lot of fun, Chris. Thanks for letting me pick your brain and being here at this lovely cafe. And till next time.
Thank you, Zan. This is a fun experiment, and hopefully we didn't annoy the live studio audience here at Aperture Cafe too much. They look fairly disaffected. I think that we're just part of the ambiance. Our discussion is as inobtrusive as the soft jazz that's been playing in the background throughout our conversation. And with that, my dear friends, we bid you adieu. Until next week, for Synthesis and Sophistry, I'm Christopher C. York.
And I'm Zan Plesner.